Hello, my name is Tiruneh, and today I'll be presenting my project, which is titled Music and the Developing Brain, Advancing Language Processing in Educational Equity. My mentor was Miss Marissa Tate. So, this research asks a simple but important question. Can music help bridge gaps in education for children who are at disadvantage? And more specifically, can music interventions improve language processing, which is one of the most critical skills for learning? Here is the problem. In the US, about one-fifth of children either live in poverty, attend high poverty schools, or both. Poverty doesn't just mean lower resources at home, but it also shows up in schools as underfunded classrooms, fewer extracurriculars, and lower teacher support. Over the long term, these children are more likely to fall behind academically and socially. Now, if you add neurodevelopmental challenges into the picture, like autism spectrum disorder, the barriers multiply. Children with autism may struggle with receptive language, expressive language, or social communication, making it even harder to benefit from traditional classroom instruction. So the question becomes, how do we provide interventions that are not only effective but also affordable? So you may be asking, why music? Music is a powerful candidate because it activates nearly every part of the brain at once. Neuroscience studies have previously shown that music training can enhance attention, memory, and even IQ. What makes music more particularly exciting is accessibility. You don't even need to be specialized or have special equipment. You don't need to be highly trained to introduce it into a classroom. And it's engaging for children, which is something they naturally enjoy. Researchers have previously looked at music in relation to cognitive skills like attention or working memory, but less research has directly examined its impact on language acquisition. Since language is the foundation for all learning, I wanted to explore whether music could directly support it. So, my research question is, to what extent do music interventions influence language processing, and can they improve educational outcomes for children with or without autism who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds? To investigate this, we examined two different data sets, the first being the Big World Club. The Big World Club studied neurotypical children in low SES schools, and they created a digital vocabulary platform which was rolled out to over 800 preschool students and kindergarten students across 47 schools in 3 different US states. Here's how the program worked. Each week, the children would be introduced to 5 new vocabulary words, and they learned these words through videos, digital storybooks, music videos, and even dance activities. At the end of each week, there was a review session to reinforce what they had learned. Assessments were conducted at 2 points, one at the 4 months after intervention and around 6 months later. For my study, I narrowed down the dataset from children from low SES schools, defined where 75% or more had access to free reduced lunch, to about 268 children, with 180 being in the treatment group and 88 being in the control group. This data set allowed me to see how well the tech-based music interventions could boost vocabulary in children facing economic barriers. The second data set was the ORF music therapy. ORF music therapy is a rhythm-based, highly interactive approach to music education. It combines movement, percussion instruments, singing, and improvisation. It's been adapted for therapeutic use in children with autism. This study included 93 children between the ages of 3 and 6. For this analysis, we focused on the 18 children who came from low socioeconomic backgrounds. These children's languages were measured, their skills were measured across standardized developmental scales, and the points that we are focusing on were receptive language and expressive language. As defined in the bottom, receptive language is the ability to understand and process spoken, written, and sign language, including words, sentences, gestures, and instructions. Expressive language is the ability to understand and convey messages and words and gestures and even facial expressions to express thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs. This study followed this flowchart, which is where the students were randomly assigned into control and treatment, and then the control group had received comprehensive rehabilitation, which includes sensory, language, and social interaction training, and then the treatment, in addition to the comprehensive rehabilitation, received the ORF music therapy. Before both treatments, there was a pre-assessment at T1, and then following up, both groups received the T2 assessment, which is 3 months follow-up, and T3 assessment, which is 6 months follow-up. So on to the results. So, as a result of the Big World Club, we saw that in the treatment group of 180 children, there was an average vocabulary score that went up from about 23 words correctly identified at 4 months to about 24 words identified at 6 months. This sounds small, but it was a statistically significant improvement with a p-value of 0.001. This means that the chance of this happening randomly is less than 1 in 10,000. The control group, which had 88 children, also improved slightly from about 21.5 words to just under 23 words between the two assessments. Their improvement was also significant, but not as strong as the treatment group. When we directly compare the groups, the treatment group consistently outperformed the control group at both checkpoints. At 4 months, the treatment children identified about 2 or more words on average, and at 6 months, they were still ahead by about 1.5 words. Both of these differences were statistically significant. A takeaway here is that the music and dance vocabulary training worked, and the children in the program didn't just memorize the words, but they retained it later on, and they were still ahead of the control group months later. Despite this, we also noticed that the rate of the growth slowed down between the 4 and the 6 month range. This suggested that without reinforcements, the benefit would start to plateau. In other words, the program was effective but needed to be used consistently to make continuous gains. But starting with the expressive language, this is, as we said before, the ability to use words to communicate. In this treatment group, the children had expressive language scores that rose from about 27 points at baseline to about 40 points after 6 months. This was a substantial increase of 13 points, which was statistically significant with a p-value of about 0.01 or 0.13. Control group, which had 10 children, also improved from about 23 points to 34 points over the same period. Interestingly, the improvement was also significant, and in fact, the size of the gain was slightly larger than the treatment group. When we compare the two groups directly, the treatment group did have a higher score at the 6 month point, 40 compared to 34, but there wasn't a statistically significant difference. So we cannot say confidently that the ORF therapy was better than the control condition for expressive language. So for expressive language, both groups improved, but the ORF didn't provide a clear advantage. For receptive language, the treatment group started with an average score of 19 points at baseline and then had rose to 30 points after 6 months. This was a significant improvement of 11 points, which was highly significant with a p-value of 0.02. The control group had also improved, but not as strongly, from about 17 points to 26 points. This was significant, but the gain was all smaller, about 9 points. When we compare the two groups directly, the treatment group had consistently higher scores. At the 3 months, the groups were almost identical, but then by 6 months, the treatment group had pulled ahead by about 4 points. Again, this difference wasn't quite statistically significant, but the pattern suggests that the ORF therapy is more effective for receptive language than the control. The key insight here is that the receptive language improved more reliably than the expressive language. This makes sense developmentally because, as we'll talk about later, comprehension typically develops before production. So the expressive language is more expected to develop later on than the receptive. First, taking these results together, we can see that music interventions do improve language skills in both neurotypical and neurodivergent children. Music interventions have proven to be a vital evidence-based method to support cognitive development of children facing educational advantages. Secondly, consistency matters. Without reinforcements, the effects weaken over time. This is why both datasets showed progress in later stages. Third, music may be particularly effective for receptive language. This suggests that music could be especially useful in early childhood when comprehension develops before expression, which is more explained down here before. As shown in a previous study, we can see that expressive language tends to develop later on in earlier development in children, so we expected that the receptive language gains would be stronger. The limitations of this study include, for the ORF study, was a small sample size. The ORF study, when we narrowed down to the low socioeconomic status, we only had about 18 children to look from. And this study was also taken place outside of the US in China. So it was harder to compare side by side with the US study, knowing that there was some limitations in cultural and schooling differences. There was also a lack of later follow-up between both studies in the Big World Club and the ORF Music Study, since their latest follow-up was at 6 months. In the Big World Club, we also had a variation in the group size. As we saw when we narrowed down to low socioeconomic status, there was about 180 in the treatment group and only 88 in the control group. Also, it was harder to tell if the implementation was consistent between the classrooms because the teachers dealt out the interventions to the students individually, and there wasn't any consistent way to keep track of how much and how frequent the teachers were giving it. So for future studies, we can say that we should conduct a long-term study with a larger sample to assess the lasting neurological effects and isolate specific music therapy techniques to identify which are most effective for different learning outcomes. So to conclude, as I said before, we should advocate for the integration of consistent music-based programs into early childhood education so that we can give every child who has any disadvantage a better start. Protecting the neurological development of vulnerable children from day one is a priority for creating a more equitable future. I would like to thank my mentor, Marissa Tate, and the Talaria Institute for giving the guidance, and I'd also like to thank the researchers who made their data publicly available and the participants who made this study possible. Thank you.